Pay attention to this home security footage from a bedroom in Savannah, Georgia. You're looking at an elderly woman lying in bed, and sitting in a chair beside her is an antique porcelain doll. Watch carefully. Over the next few seconds, the doll's head slowly turns toward the bed, its glass eyes seeming to focus on the woman sleeping there. See how the doll's position shifts slightly, as if it's leaning forward to get a better look. This isn't a paranormal phenomenon. This is evidence of one of the most twisted murder plots ever documented. A daughter who lived secretly in her mother's attic for over a year, using a modified doll with hidden cameras and motors to psychologically torment and monitor the woman she was slowly poisoning to death. In the next 2 hours, you're going to hear how greed, resentment, and technological manipulation combined to create a nightmare that an elderly woman couldn't escape, even in her own bedroom. You know that feeling when you walk into an antique shop and see rows of old dolls staring at you with their glass eyes? That slight chill that runs down your spine, even though you know they're just porcelain and paint? For most of us, it's a momentary discomfort that we laugh off. But for Constance Whitfield, that feeling became her daily reality in the final months of her life. And it wasn't irrational fear. It was a warning her subconscious was desperately trying to send her. Constance was 68 years old in the fall of 2004, living in a beautiful Victorian home in Savannah's historic district. The house had been in her family for 3 generations, filled with antiques, oil paintings, and an extensive collection of porcelain dolls that Constance had been gathering since she was a young woman. She had over 200 dolls displayed throughout the house, Victorian-era dolls with elaborate dresses, German bisque dolls from the 1800s, French fashion dolls with human hair wigs. To Constance, they were treasures, pieces of history, works of art. She'd been widowed for 12 years, since her husband Harold died of a heart attack in 1992. They'd never had much money, but Harold had left her the house free and clear, along with a modest life insurance policy and pension that allowed Constance to live comfortably without having to work. She volunteered at the local historical society, hosted tea parties for her friends, and spent her days caring for her beloved dolls and maintaining the beautiful old house. Constance had one child, a daughter named Vivian Crane, and if this were a normal story, Vivian would have been there helping her aging mother, maybe living nearby, checking in regularly. But this isn't a normal story, because by October 2004, Vivian wasn't just estranged from her mother. She was living in Constance's attic, watching her through modified dolls with hidden cameras, and slowly poisoning her to death. To understand how things got so twisted, we need to go back to 2002, when Constance made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. Vivian Crane had always been difficult. Even as a child, she'd been manipulative, jealous, prone to violent tantrums when she didn't get her way. As she grew older, the behavior got worse. She dropped out of college after 2 semesters, moved back home, and proceeded to live off her parents for the next 15 years. She didn't work, didn't contribute to the household, just drifted from one failed scheme to another, a jewelry business that never sold anything, a catering company that folded after 3 months, an online vintage clothing store that consisted entirely of items stolen from Constance's closet. Harold and Constance enabled it, the way parents sometimes do when they don't know how else to help their child. They gave her money, made excuses for her failures, hoped she'd eventually figure things out. But after Harold died, Constance started to see things more clearly. Without her husband there to mediate, she saw Vivian for what she really was, a 40-year-old woman with no job, no skills, no ambition, and an expectation that her mother would support her forever. The breaking point came in March 2002. Vivian, then 40 years old, had racked up $35,000 in credit card debt, cards that were in Constance's name, but that Vivian had been using without permission. When Constance discovered this, she finally did what she should have done years earlier. She kicked Vivian out of the house. "You're an adult," Constance told her daughter, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. "You're 40 years old. I've supported you long enough. It's time for you to take care of yourself." Vivian was furious. She screamed, threatened, even threw a crystal vase at the wall. But Constance stood firm. She gave Vivian 1 month to find a job and an apartment, and then she changed the locks. Vivian moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of Savannah and got a job as a cashier at a grocery store. She hated it, hated the work, hated the small apartment, hated having to budget her meager paychecks. She blamed her mother for everything. In Vivian's mind, Constance had betrayed her, abandoned her, ruined her life. For the next 6 months, Vivian and Constance didn't speak. Then, in September 2002, Constance had a health scare, a minor stroke that left her hospitalized for a week. Vivian showed up at the hospital, apologetic and concerned, playing the role of the devoted daughter. Constance, lonely and scared, accepted the apology. They reconciled, or so it seemed, but Vivian hadn't forgiven anything. She'd simply realized that she needed to be in her mother's life if she wanted to eventually inherit the house and whatever money Constance had saved. She started visiting regularly, bringing groceries, helping with household chores, slowly working her way back into her mother's trust. And that's when Vivian discovered something that changed everything. Constance had updated her will. In the new version, the house and the bulk of Constance's estate would go to the Savannah Historical Society with only a small trust fund, $50,000, set aside for Vivian. Constance's reasoning, as stated in a letter attached to the will, was clear. "I love my daughter, but I cannot in good conscience leave her a substantial inheritance that she will squander. I hope the trust fund will help her, but the house and my collections belong with people who will care for them as I have." Vivian found the will in December 2002, while snooping through her mother's desk during a visit. She was enraged, devastated, and, most dangerously, determined to fix the situation. She couldn't just ask Constance to change the will back. Her mother had made her position clear. But if Constance were to die before making any further changes, and if Vivian could somehow contest the will or make it look invalid, that's when Vivian started planning murder. At first, her plan was simple. She'd make her mother's death look like an accident. A fall down the stairs, maybe, or a medication mix-up. But Constance was careful, healthy for her age, and had a friend who checked on her daily. An obvious accident would raise questions. So Vivian came up with something more elaborate, something that would take time, but would be impossible to detect until it was too late. She would poison her mother slowly, over many months, with small doses of arsenic that would mimic the symptoms of natural aging and illness. By the time Constance died, it would look like natural causes. Heart failure maybe, or organ failure related to her previous stroke. There was just one problem. Vivian lived across town, worked irregular hours at the grocery store, and couldn't be at her mother's house every day to administer the poison. She needed access to the house without her mother knowing. She needed to be able to come and go freely, to monitor Constance's condition, to adjust her plans as needed. That's when Vivian remembered the attic. The Whitfield house had a large, finished attic that had once been servants' quarters back in the 1890s. It had its own staircase, separate from the main house, accessible through a door in the hallway that Constance rarely opened. The attic had been used for storage for decades. Boxes of old clothes, furniture that didn't fit anywhere else, trunks full of papers and photographs. Constance never went up there. Her knees were bad, and climbing stairs was painful. She'd told Vivian years ago that she didn't even remember everything that was stored in the attic. It was just accumulated family history that she'd never gotten around to sorting through. In March 2003, Vivian made a copy of her mother's house key during one of her visits. Over the next 2 weeks, she quietly moved supplies into the attic: a sleeping bag, non-perishable food, water bottles, a camping lantern, and some books. She tested her theory by spending a night there while her mother slept 2 floors below. Constance never noticed. Vivian quit her job at the grocery store, told her landlord she was moving out of state for a new job opportunity, and in April 2003 moved into her mother's attic full-time. She was now a ghost living in Constance's house, coming and going through the back door late at night when her mother was asleep, spending her days hiding in the attic, and slowly poisoning Constance's tea with arsenic she'd harvested from an old taxidermy kit she found in the basement. The taxidermy kit belonged to Harold, who'd briefly taken up the hobby in the 1970s before abandoning it. Vivian found it in a storage closet in the basement, covered in dust, but still containing several bottles of arsenic trioxide, a compound that had once been commonly used in taxidermy to preserve animal skins. The bottles were old, the labels faded, but the arsenic inside was still potent. Vivian researched arsenic poisoning extensively, using the public library computers when she ventured out late at night. She couldn't risk using her laptop's internet connection from the attic. It might be traced. She learned about dosages, symptoms, detection methods, and how to administer it in ways that would mimic natural illness. She read about famous poisoning cases, studied toxicology reports, and calculated exactly how much arsenic she'd need to use to kill Constance slowly over many months without triggering obvious alarm bells. But here's where Vivian's plan got truly twisted. She didn't just want to kill her mother. She wanted to psychologically torment her first. She wanted Constance to suffer, to feel afraid, to experience the kind of helplessness that Vivian felt when she'd been kicked out of the house. And she knew exactly how to do it, using her mother's beloved doll collection. Constance had always been slightly unsettled by dolls at night. She'd mentioned it once, years ago, how the glass eyes seemed to follow you in the dim light, how their frozen expressions could look sinister in certain shadows. It was a mild discomfort, nothing serious, but Vivian remembered. So Vivian took one of the dolls from the collection, a particularly eerie Victorian-era doll with dark hair and porcelain skin, and modified it. She carefully opened the back of the doll's head and installed a small wireless camera and a tiny servo motor connected to the neck mechanism. With her laptop, she could watch the camera feed from the attic and remotely move the doll's head and body. The modifications were subtle. Unless you were looking for them, you'd never notice anything wrong with the doll. The camera and motors were purchased from an electronics hobby store in Atlanta during one of Vivian's nighttime excursions. She'd driven there in a car she'd stolen from a parking garage, taking it late at night, driving the 2 hours to Atlanta, making her purchases with cash, and returning the car before dawn. The theft was never even reported. The owner assumed he'd simply forgotten where he'd parked. Vivian had always been good with technology. As a teenager, she'd been fascinated by electronics and programming, spending hours taking apart radios and computers to see how they worked. It was one of the few areas where she'd shown genuine aptitude. Now she was using those skills to transform an innocent antique into an instrument of psychological torture. Vivian placed this modified doll in her mother's bedroom, positioning it in a chair near the bed where Constance would see it when she woke up. Then, late at night, when Constance was asleep, Vivian would use the remote controls to make the doll's head turn slowly, to make it appear to be watching Constance. She installed a small wireless camera in the bedroom to record the results. The first time it happened, Constance woke up and saw the doll turn toward her bed. She got up, turned the doll to face the wall, and went back to sleep, assuming she'd just positioned it poorly earlier. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. After a week of this, Constance started to get nervous. She moved the doll to a different room. But then another doll, one that had been facing the fireplace in the living room, was found facing the couch where Constance napped. Then a doll in the hallway appeared to have moved from its shelf to a lower table, positioned as if it were watching the stairs. Vivian had modified several dolls by this point, creating a network of surveillance devices throughout the house. She could watch Constance from multiple angles, track her movements, see what she was doing at any time. And she could move the dolls remotely, creating the impression that they were alive, watching, following Constance through her own home. Constance was 68 years old, living alone in a big old house, and her dolls appeared to be moving on their own. She started to wonder if she was losing her mind. Was it early dementia? Was stress from her previous stroke causing her to forget where she'd placed things? Or was something else happening? She mentioned it to her friend, Eleanor Ross, during their weekly tea in May 2003. "I know it sounds silly," Constance said, laughing nervously, "but I keep finding my dolls in different positions. I'll put one facing the window, and the next day it's turned around. Completely." Eleanor, trying to be helpful, suggested that maybe the vibrations from traffic outside were causing the dolls to shift position, or maybe Constance was moving them absent-mindedly and not remembering. Constance wanted to believe that, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The psychological warfare continued for months. Vivian, watching from her hidden cameras and living in the attic, became obsessed with tormenting her mother. She'd move dolls during the day when Constance was out running errands. She'd make strange sounds at night, footsteps in the attic, creaking doors, soft thuds that could be dismissed as the house settling, but were actually Vivian deliberately creating noise. And all the while, she was poisoning Constance's tea. Small doses, just enough to make her feel chronically unwell, tired, nauseous, weak, but not enough to kill her quickly. Vivian wanted this to last. She wanted her mother to suffer. Vivian's daily routine in the attic became almost ritualistic. She'd wake around noon after Constance had finished her morning tea, which Vivian had poisoned the night before. She'd check the camera feeds, watching her mother move slowly through the house, observing the effects of the latest dose. She'd eat her own meals, canned goods, crackers, foods that didn't need refrigeration and wouldn't smell enough to alert Constance. She'd read books, mostly true crime and mysteries, finding dark humor in the fact that she was living out her own twisted version of a locked room mystery. At night, after Constance had gone to sleep, Vivian would emerge from the attic like a ghost. She'd move through the darkened house, repositioning dolls, checking camera angles, preparing the next day's dose of poison. She'd stand in Constance's bedroom doorway sometimes, watching her mother sleep, feeling nothing but impatience for this to be over. The isolation was difficult, but Vivian had prepared for it. She'd always been a loner, uncomfortable around people, preferring her own company. Living in the attic wasn't that different from living in her cheap apartment, except she didn't have to pay rent, and she had the satisfaction of knowing she was destroying the woman who'd destroyed her life. By the summer of 2003, Constance had developed a genuine phobia of her doll collection. She'd packed away most of the dolls in boxes, unable to stand looking at them anymore. But she couldn't bring herself to get rid of them completely. They were too valuable, too much a part of her history. So they stayed in the house, boxed up in closets and the guest room, silent witnesses to Constance's deteriorating health and mental state. Constance's friends started to worry. She'd lost weight, seemed anxious and distracted, talked about not sleeping well. She went to her doctor multiple times, complaining of fatigue and nausea, but the tests came back relatively normal. Maybe a vitamin deficiency, maybe stress, maybe just the effects of aging. The doctor prescribed vitamins and sleeping pills and told Constance to try to relax, to maybe see a therapist if the anxiety got worse. Nobody suspected arsenic poisoning. Nobody suspected that Constance's own daughter was living in her attic, literally hovering over her like a malevolent spirit, poisoning her and tormenting her with modified dolls. Dr. William Chen, Constance's primary physician, would later testify at trial about his failure to recognize the poisoning. The symptoms were consistent with so many other conditions: anemia, vitamin deficiency, depression, side effects from her other medications, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. Arsenic poisoning wasn't even on my radar. I should have been more thorough. I should have asked more questions about her home environment, about who had access to her food and drinks. I failed her. In September 2003, Constance installed a home security system. She told Eleanor she wanted to feel safer in the house, maybe catch whoever was breaking in and moving her things. The security company installed cameras in the living room, the front and back entrances, and, at Constance's insistence, in her bedroom. Vivian panicked when she saw the cameras being installed. She watched from a crack in the attic door as the technicians worked, realizing that her movements in the house might now be captured on video. She'd have to be more careful, move only when she was absolutely certain Constance was asleep or out of the house. But here's the thing about being extremely careful. It's exhausting. It's stressful. And stress makes people make mistakes. Vivian started making small errors, leaving the attic door slightly ajar, forgetting to move a food wrapper she'd left in the kitchen trash, walking too heavily on the attic floor above Constance's bedroom. Constance noticed. She'd hear footsteps above her at night, footsteps that sounded too deliberate to be rodents or the house settling. She started to wonder if someone was living in her attic, but the thought seemed absurd. The attic door was always locked when she checked it. Vivian would lock it from the inside when she heard Constance approaching. Who would be living in her attic? Still, Constance called the police in October 2003 for a welfare check on herself, essentially. She explained that she kept hearing noises, that things kept moving, that she was worried someone might be breaking into her house. Officer Michael Foster came out, walked through the house, checked all the doors and windows, even climbed up into the attic to look around. He found nothing. Vivian had heard the doorbell and hidden in a narrow space behind an old wardrobe where Foster didn't think to look. The officer concluded that Constance was probably hearing normal house sounds amplified by anxiety and an overactive imagination. "This house is over 120 years old, ma'am," Foster told her kindly. "Old houses make a lot of noise. And with your doll collection, I can understand why you might feel a little on edge. Maybe consider staying with a friend for a few days? Give yourself a break from the stress?" But Constance didn't want to leave her house. This was her home. She'd lived here most of her adult life. She shouldn't have to leave because she was scared of her own dolls. So she stayed. And Vivian, emboldened by the police finding nothing, continued her campaign of psychological torture and slow poisoning. By December 2003, Constance's health had deteriorated significantly. She'd lost 30 pounds, had constant fatigue, experienced episodes of confusion and memory loss. Her doctor ordered more extensive tests, including tests for heavy metal poisoning, but the arsenic levels in her blood were just below the threshold that would have triggered alarm. Vivian had been careful with her dosing, keeping it low enough to avoid detection, but high enough to slowly destroy her mother's organs. The modified doll in Constance's bedroom remained, still occasionally moving when Vivian controlled it remotely. Constance had tried to throw the doll away multiple times, but each time she did, it would reappear. Vivian would simply retrieve it from the trash and place it back in the bedroom while Constance slept or was out. In January 2004, Constance wrote in her diary, "I'm losing my mind. The doctors can't find anything wrong, but I know something is happening to me. The doll moves. I hear footsteps. Food disappears from my kitchen. Either I'm going insane, or something evil is in this house with me. I'm so tired. I just want it to stop." That diary entry would later become evidence in the case, heartbreaking proof of how thoroughly Vivian had terrorized her own mother. In March 2004, Constance made a decision that would ultimately save her life, at least temporarily. She invited Eleanor to move in with her. Eleanor's husband had recently died, and she was looking for somewhere to stay while she figured out her next steps. Constance offered her the guest room, happy to have company and hoping that having someone else in the house would make her feel safer. Eleanor moved in on March 15, 2004, and everything changed. With Eleanor in the house, Vivian couldn't move as freely. She couldn't make as much noise. She couldn't poison Constance's tea because Eleanor might drink it too. Her whole operation was compromised by this new presence. Constance's health actually started to improve over the next few weeks. With no new doses of arsenic, her body began to recover slightly. She had more energy, felt less nauseous, started to think maybe she'd just been stressed and needed company. But Vivian was furious. Eleanor was ruining everything. The longer Eleanor stayed, the more Constance would recover, and the more obvious it would become that something had been making Constance sick, something that stopped when Eleanor arrived. Vivian needed Eleanor gone. But how? She couldn't just ask her to leave. She wasn't supposed to be in the house at all. She couldn't make it look like the house was haunted because Eleanor was much more skeptical than Constance and wouldn't be frightened by moving dolls. So Vivian decided she needed to escalate. She'd been playing the long game, slowly poisoning Constance over more than a year. But now she needed to end this quickly before Eleanor figured out what was happening. In late April 2004, Vivian started planning to poison both women at once. A large dose of arsenic in the sugar bowl that both Constance and Eleanor used in their tea. It would make them both violently ill, and hopefully with an older woman and no clear source of. Poisoning, it would look like food poisoning or some kind of environmental contamination. But before Vivian could execute this plan, Eleanor left. She'd received news that her daughter in Florida needed help with a new baby, and she packed up and moved out on May 2, 2004. Constance was disappointed but understanding, and once again, she was alone in the house. Vivian resumed her poisoning schedule immediately, but this time she increased the dosages. She was tired of waiting, tired of hiding in the attic, tired of living like a rat in the walls of what should have been her house. She wanted this over with. By September 2004, Constance was bedridden more days than not. She'd fallen twice in the past month, once breaking 2 ribs. She couldn't keep food down. She'd lost 50 pounds from her original weight. Her doctor had her on a dozen different medications for various symptoms, but nothing seemed to help. Eleanor, back from Florida, was visiting regularly again and was horrified by Constance's condition. She urged her friend to go to the hospital, to get more aggressive testing, to let her come stay again. But Constance was exhausted. She was 68 years old, felt like she was dying, and honestly, part of her was ready to let go. She made Eleanor promise to make sure the Historical Society got the house and the dolls when she was gone. Eleanor, crying, promised she would. On October 3, 2004, Constance Whitfield died in her sleep. Eleanor found her the next morning, lying peacefully in her bed with that damned porcelain doll sitting in the chair next to her, its glass eyes seemingly fixed on Constance's face. Eleanor Ross called 911 at 8:47 a.m. on October 3, 2004. She was crying, barely coherent, saying her friend was dead and she needed help. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Constance had been dead for hours, probably since sometime in the middle of the night. The paramedics noted that there were no obvious signs of trauma. No blood, no marks on Constance's body, no signs of a struggle. The bedroom was neat. Constance looked peaceful, and given her age and recent health problems, natural causes seemed like the most likely explanation. But Eleanor wasn't satisfied. She'd watched her friend waste away over the past year and a half, had seen her go from a vibrant, healthy woman to a shell of herself, and it didn't make sense. Constance had been active, had no major health problems before 2003, and then suddenly she was dying, and nobody could figure out why. Something was wrong, Eleanor insisted to the responding officer. She kept saying things were moving in her house, that she heard sounds, that her dolls were being repositioned. I thought she was just stressed, but what if it was something else? What if someone was doing something to her? Officer William Harris took Eleanor's statement, noted her concerns, but gently explained that elderly people sometimes experience confusion and paranoia, especially when living alone. Constance had been examined by doctors multiple times, and no one had found anything suspicious. Sometimes, sad as it was, people just declined in their later years. An autopsy was scheduled as a matter of routine for any unattended death. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chen, performed the examination on October 5, 2004. She noted the significant weight loss, evidence of malnutrition and organ stress, but nothing that immediately screamed murder. The preliminary cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, likely secondary to malnutrition and systemic weakness. The case would have been closed there if Eleanor hadn't kept pushing. She called the medical examiner's office 3 times over the next week, insisting that something was wrong, that Constance hadn't died of natural causes. She mentioned the moving dolls, the sounds in the house, Constance's conviction that someone was tormenting her. Dr. Chen, tired of the calls but also curious, decided to run additional toxicology tests. The standard tox screen had come back clean, but there were hundreds of poisons that wouldn't show up on a basic panel. Dr. Chen specifically requested testing for heavy metals, including arsenic, lead, and mercury. The results came back on October 18, 2004. Constance Whitfield had elevated levels of arsenic in her system, not enough to have killed her immediately, but consistent with long-term exposure over many months. The levels were high enough that Dr. Chen immediately changed the manner of death from natural to pending investigation and contacted the Savannah Police Department. Detective Richard Martinez was assigned to the case. He was 42 years old, had been with the SPD for 18 years, and had worked dozens of homicides. But this one was unusual, a potential poisoning of an elderly woman who'd been dead for 2 weeks before anyone even suspected foul play. Martinez started by interviewing Eleanor again. This time, he listened carefully to everything she said about the moving dolls, the sounds in the house, Constance's declining health, the strange events that had been happening for over a year. "Did Constance have any enemies?" Martinez asked. "Anyone who might want to hurt her?" Eleanor thought carefully. "She was the sweetest woman you'd ever meet. Everyone loved her. Well, except..." Eleanor paused. "Her daughter, Vivian. They had a terrible falling out a few years ago. Constance kicked her out of the house, changed her will to leave almost everything to the Historical Society instead of to Vivian." "Where is Vivian now?" "I have no idea. Last I heard, she moved out of state for a job. Constance hadn't heard from her in over a year." Martinez made a note to find Vivian Crane. If anyone had a motive to poison Constance, it was the daughter who'd been disinherited. But first, he needed to search the house and look for evidence of how the arsenic had been administered. On October 20th, 2004, Martinez and a forensic team entered Constance's home with a search warrant. The house was a time capsule, Victorian furniture, old paintings, and boxes of dolls everywhere. The team photographed everything, collected samples from the kitchen, testing for arsenic in food containers, tea, sugar, anything Constance might have ingested, and examined the security system. That's when they found the bedroom footage. The security system had been recording continuously since September 2003, saving files to a hard drive in the basement. The team seized the hard drive and brought it back to the station for review. Detective Martinez sat down to watch months of footage, fast-forwarding through most of it, but paying attention whenever he saw movement in the frame. What he saw made his blood run cold. The doll moved, not just once, not just random shifting that could be explained by vibrations or air currents. The doll's head would turn slowly, deliberately, to face Constance's bed. Sometimes its body would lean forward slightly, and it always happened at night when Constance was sleeping. But here's what really got Martinez's attention. In some frames, visible for just a second or two, there was a shadow. A human shadow cast by the nightlight in Constance's room, appearing near the doorway or at the edge of the frame. Someone had been in that room, moving quietly while Constance slept. Martinez called in a video forensics expert, who enhanced the footage and confirmed what Martinez suspected. Someone had been entering Constance's bedroom regularly, multiple times a week, for months. The expert couldn't get a clear image of the person's face. The camera angle was wrong, and the person stayed in the shadows, but it was definitely a human, not a ghost or a supernatural phenomenon. The doll, when examined by forensics, revealed its secrets. The small camera hidden in its head, the servo motor attached to its neck, the wireless receiver that allowed someone to control it remotely. This wasn't a haunted doll. This was a sophisticated surveillance and psychological warfare device. Someone was watching Constance, Martinez told his captain. Someone modified this doll, planted it in her bedroom, and used it to terrify her while they poisoned her. This wasn't just murder. This was torture. The question was, who? And where were they? Martinez started with the obvious suspect, Vivian Crane, but tracking her down proved difficult. She'd left her apartment in late March 2003, told her landlord she was moving out of state for work, and then nothing. No new address on file with the post office. No employment records. No credit card activity. It was like she'd disappeared. Martinez put out a bolo, be on the lookout, for Vivian, contacted police departments in neighboring states, checked with her former employer at the grocery store. Nobody had seen her in over a year and a half. Then Martinez got a call from Eleanor Ross. "Detective, I've been thinking about something. When I was staying with Constance back in March and April of this year, I kept hearing sounds in the house. Footsteps above Constance's bedroom, coming from what I think was the attic. Constance had mentioned hearing those sounds too. I just dismissed it as the house settling, but now I'm wondering, you think someone might have been in the attic? I know it sounds crazy, but what if? Constance never went up there. Her knees were bad. And the police officer who checked the house last year, did he search the attic thoroughly?" Martinez pulled the report from Officer Foster's 2003 welfare check. Foster had climbed into the attic, looked around briefly, but admitted in his notes that the space was large and cluttered with decades of stored items. Someone could conceivably hide up there if they knew Foster was coming and had a good hiding spot. On October 23, 2004, Martinez returned to Constance's house with a full search team. This time, they were going to tear the place apart if necessary. They started with the attic. What they found was astounding. In the far corner of the attic, hidden behind an old wardrobe and several boxes, was a makeshift living space. A sleeping bag, empty food containers, water bottles, a camping lantern, books, and, most damning, a laptop computer with wireless connectivity. The laptop was still there, its battery dead but the hard drive intact. Forensic technicians powered it up and found a treasure trove of evidence. The control software for the modified doll, video feeds from the hidden camera in Constance's bedroom, detailed logs of when arsenic had been administered and in what doses, and a journal, hundreds of pages of typed entries detailing Vivian's plan, her daily activities, her observations of her mother's declining health, and her growing rage at having to wait so long for Constance to die. One entry from August 2004 read, "She's taking forever to die. I've increased the dose again, but her body is more resilient than I expected. Eleanor's visit set me back months. I'm running low on supplies and I can't leave the house during the day anymore. Too risky. But it's almost over. Maybe 2 more months at most. Then the house will be mine, the dolls will be mine, and I can finally live my life." Another entry from September 2004. "She fell again today. Broke some ribs. Good. Maybe the injury will finish what the arsenic started. I watched her cry in pain for an hour before she finally took the sleeping pills and passed out. I should feel something. Guilt, pity, anything. But all I feel is impatience. Just die already, Mother. You've ruined my life long enough." Martinez felt sick reading the entries. This woman had lived in her mother's attic for over a year and a half, watching her suffer, poisoning her slowly, tormenting her with modified dolls and mysterious sounds, all while chronicling it like some twisted science experiment. But where was Vivian now? The laptop showed that its last activity was on October 2nd, 2004, the day before Constance died. After that, nothing. Had Vivian fled immediately after her mother's death? Was she still in Savannah? Martinez issued an arrest warrant for Vivian Crane on charges of first-degree murder and organized a manhunt. They checked bus stations, train stations, the airport. They contacted her known associates, her former co-workers, anyone who might know where she'd gone. The break came on October 25th, 2004, 2 days after the attic discovery. A clerk at a budget motel on the outskirts of Savannah called the police tip line. A woman matching Vivian's description had checked in 3 weeks earlier, paying cash for a month's stay, keeping to herself, barely leaving her room. Martinez and a tactical team arrived at the motel within 20 minutes. They knocked on the door of room 117. No answer. They knocked again, identified themselves as police. Still no answer. They breached the door and found Vivian sitting on the bed, staring at the wall, surrounded by fast food containers and empty soda bottles. She didn't resist, didn't try to run. She just looked at the officers and said, "Is she actually dead this time, or is this another false alarm?" Martinez read Vivian her Miranda rights and arrested her. In the car on the way to the station, Vivian started talking, even though Martinez had advised her to wait for a lawyer. "I had to make sure she was really dead," Vivian said. "I waited a few days after she stopped moving, just to be certain. I didn't want to leave the attic and then find out she'd survived somehow. That would ruin everything." "You lived in your mother's attic for over a year?" Martinez asked, still trying to process the level of planning and dedication this required. 18 months, Vivian corrected. April 2003 to October 2004. It was uncomfortable at first, but you get used to it. The hardest part was staying quiet during the day when she was home, and dealing with Eleanor when she moved in for those 2 months. But I managed. I always manage. "Why did you kill her, Vivian?" Vivian looked at Martinez like he was stupid. "For the house. For the money. Because she owed me. I was her daughter. Everything should have been mine. But she gave it all away to some historical society. People she'd never even met got my inheritance. That wasn't fair, so I fixed it. By slowly poisoning her and psychologically torturing her for 18 months. I wanted her to suffer," Vivian said simply. "She made me suffer when she kicked me out, when she changed the will, when she chose strangers over her own daughter. So yes, I wanted her to suffer before she died. Is that so wrong?" Martinez didn't answer. Some questions don't need responses. Vivian Crane's trial began in April 2005, 6 months after her arrest. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Sharon Miller, who called it one of the most calculated and cruel murders she'd encountered in her 20-year career. The evidence against Vivian was overwhelming. The laptop from the attic contained her detailed journals, her control software for the modified doll, and video footage from the hidden camera. The security footage from Constance's bedroom showed the doll moving and the shadow of someone entering the room. Forensic analysis of Constance's body showed long-term arsenic exposure. The modified doll itself was entered into evidence, its hidden camera and motors clearly visible once experts had opened it up. And then there was Vivian's own statement to Detective Martinez in the police car, a statement her lawyer tried desperately to suppress, but that the judge ruled admissible because Vivian had been properly Mirandized and had voluntarily chosen to speak. Vivian's defense attorney, Robert Morrison, tried to argue temporary insanity. He brought in psychiatrists who testified that Vivian suffered from various personality disorders, that her relationship with her mother had been psychologically damaging, that she'd experienced a psychotic break after being disinherited. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They showed the jury excerpts from Vivian's journal, demonstrating clear, rational planning over many months. They showed the modified doll and explained the technical skill required to install the cameras and motors. This wasn't the work of someone having a psychotic break. This was calculated, methodical, technological torture. Dr. Lisa Huang, a forensic psychiatrist who'd evaluated Vivian, testified that while Vivian did show signs of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits, she was legally sane and fully understood the consequences of her actions. Ms. Crane knew what she was doing was wrong, Dr. Huang explained to the jury. She hid her presence in the house. She documented her activities in detail, showing clear understanding of the criminal nature of her actions. She modified the doll specifically to avoid detection by making her mother think the house was haunted rather than realizing someone was actively tormenting her. This is not insanity. This is extreme selfishness and callous disregard for human life. The most powerful testimony came from Eleanor Ross. Now 72 years old, Eleanor took the stand and described watching her best friend waste away, seeing the terror in Constance's eyes when she talked about the moving dolls, hearing the desperation in her voice when she insisted something was wrong. "She knew," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. On some level, Constance knew someone was hurting her, but she couldn't prove it. She couldn't make anyone believe her. And her own daughter, the person who should have protected her, was the one destroying her. I'll never forgive myself for not realizing what was happening. The prosecution played portions of the bedroom security footage for the jury. The courtroom was silent as they watched the doll's head slowly turn toward Constance's sleeping form, watch the shadow of Vivian moving through the room, watch the evidence of 18 months of psychological torture. Several jurors were visibly shaken. One woman asked to be excused and was replaced by an alternate after she broke down during the video presentation. The defense called Vivian to the stand, against her lawyer's advice. Vivian wanted to tell her side of the story, wanted to explain why she'd done what she did. It was a catastrophic mistake. Under questioning from her own attorney, Vivian described her difficult childhood, her parents' enabling behavior, the pain of being disinherited. She painted herself as a victim of her mother's cruelty, as someone who'd been pushed to desperate measures by desperation and abandonment. But when District Attorney Miller cross-examined her, everything fell apart. Ms. Crane, you lived in your mother's attic for 18 months, correct? Yes. During that time, you had many opportunities to simply leave, to walk away, to move on with your life. Is that correct? I suppose. But you didn't leave. Instead, you stayed in that attic, day after day, month after month, poisoning your mother's tea and psychologically, tormenting her with modified dolls. Why? Because she owed me. She owed me that house, that money. So this was about inheritance? About money? It was about justice, about getting what should have been mine. And you believe that killing your mother slowly, making her think she was losing her mind, watching her waste away in terror, you think that's justice? Vivian hesitated. She made me suffer first. She kicked you out of her house after you stole from her and refused to support yourself as an adult. That's hardly suffering, Ms. Crane. That's called being held accountable. The exchange continued for 2 hours, with Miller systematically dismantling every justification Vivian offered. By the end, even Vivian's lawyer looked defeated. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder, elder abuse, and multiple counts of fraud related to Vivian's attempts to access Constance's bank accounts after her death. Vivian showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She simply sat there, staring straight ahead, as if she couldn't quite believe that she wasn't going to get away with it. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Judge David Richardson allowed Eleanor to give a victim impact statement. Constance Whitfield was my best friend for 40 years, Eleanor said, her voice strong despite her tears. She was kind, generous, creative, and full of life. She loved her dolls because they represented history, artistry, beauty, and her own daughter took that love and twisted it into a weapon. She turned Constance's final year into a nightmare of confusion, fear, and pain. Constance died believing she was losing her mind, never knowing that her daughter was the monster hiding in her house. That's the cruelest part. She died without ever knowing the truth. Judge Richardson then addressed Vivian directly. His voice was cold with controlled anger. Ms. Crane, you have been convicted of murdering your mother in one of the most premeditated and cruel fashions I've encountered in my 28 years on the bench. You didn't just kill her, you terrorized her. You lived in her house like a parasite, feeding off her fear and suffering. You modified her beloved dolls into instruments of psychological torture. You poisoned her slowly, documenting her decline like some twisted experiment, all because you valued money more than you valued your own mother's life. He paused, looking at Vivian with something like disgust. You will never inherit that house. You will never profit from your mother's death. The law prohibits criminals from benefiting from their crimes, and I will personally ensure that every asset of your mother's estate goes exactly where she wanted it, to the Savannah Historical Society. First-degree murder, life in prison without possibility of parole. Elder abuse resulting in death, 15 years, concurrent. Fraud, attempting to access victims' accounts, 5 years, concurrent. Unlawful surveillance, 2 years, concurrent. Vivian Crane, at age 42, would spend the rest of her life in prison. She would never see the house again. She would never inherit anything from her mother. She would die behind bars, just as she'd sentenced her mother to die in that bedroom. The case of Constance Whitfield's murder sent shockwaves through Savannah's historic district and raised awareness about elder abuse, particularly in cases where adult children feel entitled to their parents' estates. The Savannah Historical Society took ownership of Constance's house as specified in her will. They've converted it into a small museum celebrating Victorian-era life and the art of doll making. Constance's doll collection, minus the one that Vivian modified, which was destroyed after the trial, is now on permanent display. Eleanor Ross worked with the Historical Society to create a special exhibit about Constance's life, celebrating her passion for history and preservation, rather than dwelling on the circumstances of her death. The exhibit includes photos of Constance at various ages, information about her collection, and a tribute wall where visitors can leave messages honoring her memory. The case also led to changes in how police respond to reports of elder abuse and suspicious deaths. The Savannah Police Department now has specialized training for officers dealing with elderly victims who report unusual activity in their homes. Detective Martinez, who solved the case, helped develop this training program. "We need to take elderly people seriously when they report being afraid or experiencing strange events," Martinez said in a 2007 interview. Constance Whitfield tried to tell people something was wrong. She called the police, she told her friends, but everyone dismissed her concerns as paranoia or age-related confusion. If we'd investigated more thoroughly, if we'd taken her fears seriously, we might have found Vivian living in that attic and saved Constance's life. The modified doll became infamous in forensic technology circles as an example of how everyday objects can be weaponized with simple modifications. Law enforcement agencies now include training on identifying hidden cameras and surveillance devices in domestic settings. Dr. Patricia Chen, the medical examiner who caught the arsenic poisoning, became an advocate for more comprehensive toxicology testing in suspicious deaths. "We need to look beyond the obvious," she said. Constance's death looked natural on the surface, but persistence by her friend and thorough testing revealed the truth. We owe it to victims to investigate thoroughly. Vivian Crane is currently serving her sentence at Metro State Prison in Atlanta. She's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. According to prison officials, she maintains that she was treated unfairly by the justice system and that her mother drove her to it through years of emotional abuse. She's never expressed genuine remorse for what she did to Constance. In a strange twist, Vivian has become a minor celebrity among certain true crime enthusiasts who are fascinated by the technological aspects of her crime and the psychological warfare she waged against her mother. She's received dozens of letters from people wanting to correspond with her, asking about the details of how she modified the dolls and lived undetected for 18 months. She answers some of these letters, apparently enjoying the attention. This has disturbed Eleanor and others who knew Constance. "People are treating Vivian like she's interesting or clever," Eleanor said in disgust. "But she's not interesting. She's a murderer who tortured her own mother. There's nothing fascinating about that. It's just evil." The house where Constance died is open to the public Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Visitors often comment on the peaceful atmosphere, the beautiful dolls, the lovingly preserved Victorian furnishings. Most don't realize they're standing in rooms where one of the most calculated murders in Savannah history took place. Eleanor visits the house regularly, sitting in the parlor where she and Constance used to have tea, remembering her friend not as a victim, but as a vibrant, creative woman who loved history and beauty. "Constance should be remembered for her life, not her death," Eleanor said. "She was an amazing woman who preserved a piece of Savannah's history for future generations. Yes, her daughter killed her in a horrible way, But that's not Constance's story. Her story is about love. Love for history. Love for art. Love for this beautiful city. That's what I want people to remember. For Constance Whitfield, who spent her final year living in fear, confused, and tormented by the very dolls she'd lovingly collected over decades, we remember. Not as a victim of her daughter's greed, but as a woman who cared deeply about preserving beauty and history. The house she loved so much now serves as a tribute to her passion and her memory. And for all victims of elder abuse, particularly those whose suffering goes unseen or unbelieved, we remember. We commit ourselves to listening when elderly people say something is wrong, to investigating thoroughly when deaths seem suspicious, and to treating our elders with the dignity, respect, and protection they deserve. Constance Whitfield deserved better than the death she received, but through the work of Detective Martinez, Dr. Chen, Eleanor Ross, and the Savannah Historical Society, her memory has been honored and her passion preserved. That's not justice for what was taken from her. Nothing can provide that. But it's a reminder that good people's legacies can outlive the evil that tried to destroy them.